Today we are recognizing All Saints Sunday during our worship service. We will be reading off the names of members of this community who have died within the last year since this time last year. In the more orthodox branches of the Christian church, Friday is when All Saints Day was celebrated, and yesterday is when All Souls Day was celebrated. That's because in those traditions, saints are people who are seen as being very close to God, who have met certain criteria that distinguishes them and sets them apart. And then All Souls Day is the day we remember everyone else. For us, we don't make this distinction, and we use the term saints the way Paul uses it in this letter to the Ephesians. In Ephesians, he uses the word saints frequently. It's something that in some translations is translated as the holy ones. It means all of us who are Christians, all of us who have received God's grace and who reflect God's righteousness, those who have come before us and those of us who are here. We are all among God's saints. Each of us has men and women to thank for helping make us who we are, helping to fashion our personalities and the way in which we do things. That's based on the influence that others have had. I've shared with you, I think in some context, that my dad was reared by his oldest sister and her husband because his mother had died a week after he was born. He went to live with them and with their landlady with whom they lived. Her name was Julia Frances Posey. She had no children. Her husband had long since been deceased. In her words, he was bad to drink. And one very dark and stormy night, the police just sort of busted into the house and abruptly announced to her that her husband had drowned while he was intoxicated. She had several houses that she owned, and she rented them out, and that's how she made her living. And a week after my grandmother passed away, my dad, as an infant, entered this house to live with these three people, Miss Posey becoming a godmother to him. And she said to him many years later that on that night when you were brought into this house, a very bright light came into an otherwise dark and gloomy situation. She was his primary caregiver. Together, they would decorate for the Christmas holidays. He would help her with chores around the house, particularly ones that were too difficult for her to do in her particular state. He used to say that the division was this way. He was labor and Posey was management. When my dad was very small, when he was a toddler, he was known for being very clumsy. As my aunt put it, he couldn't go through a doorway without hitting both sides of it. That led to the nickname Bumper, which became Bunker, and then was shortened to just Bump, which is what everybody in his hometown knew him as for the rest of his life. Miss Posey also was deeply involved in what was then the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Methodist church there in the town of Millen, where my dad grew up. She was the only woman on what would then have been the precursor to the administrative council because she was the communion steward. She made the bread and brought the juice to put in the little actual glass cups for communion. The bread she baked herself, and she very meticulously cut it into slices and then into squares, so everyone had a portion that was the exact same size. And because she didn't have a lot of money, she couldn't contribute a lot to the church, so she made up for it by being the custodian of the church. And she cleaned the church from one end to the other. She polished the chancel railings that were along the way. They were brass in the church where my father grew up. She vacuumed, she dusted. People would joke when they'd see a spider web in a corner some way and say, "Oh, look, Miss Posey overlooked that." But the next Sunday, it would be gone. She had such a profound influence on my dad's life that my oldest sister, whose first name is Julia, was named for her. And when she was a little baby, one of Julia's favorite things to do was just to sit and watch my oldest sister playing with toys whenever they would go over there to visit during the holiday time. Later in her life, whenever she died at a time when there had been a change in pastoral leadership. And so the new pastor did not know her that well. But he concluded the eulogy by saying, "In my time here, I've learned that there were two things that Miss Posey deeply loved. One was the Millen Methodist Church, and the other was Bunker." And Miss Posey instilled this love of Methodism within my dad. And through him, this love of Methodism was instilled within me. He went on to become a United Methodist college president, and I became a United Methodist pastor, living out the influence and the legacy of Miss Posey, even though I never met her. Today, we will be reading out the names of the saints of our church, men and women who loved this church and contributed to its ministries in many ways, by singing in the choir, by caring for this physical building and the upkeep of it, by teaching Sunday school, by serving on committees, by volunteering in the kitchen during fellowship meetings. We remember men and women who loved their families, who worked late into the night to earn the money to put bread on the table and clothes on their children's back. We remember those who stood next to their children during the ceremonies when their children were getting married. We remember the saints of this church and of your life. There are people that we knew and whom you knew, and there are people that you knew better than anyone else. And there are those memories and those influences that only you know, those things that make the relationship with them so special. These are the saints of the church that we are remembering today. But Paul mentions that just like my father and I received an influence from the legacy of Miss Posey, an influence of faith that lived on in his life and in mine, all of us share a common inheritance with Christ who bore the righteous image of God on earth, with Christ who showed us how to overcome sin and the powers of temptation, with Christ who showed us how to love one another freely and openly, with Christ who healed the sick, recovered sight to the blind, and made the lame to dance, with Christ who died a death although he was sinless for our sins, as a way of bringing back harmony to our lives and to the world, and with Christ who rose from the dead and forever abolished the power of death. Death, that one thing that we have on our minds today, because it separates us from those whose names we will be reading. Through Christ's resurrection, Christ abolished death forever. That is what we have inherited through Christ. Christ who makes us citizens of God's kingdom, a kingdom that is eternal, a kingdom in which we are all equally loved and equally forgiven and redeemed. redeemed. That is the inheritance of Christ that makes those whose names we read, those who are here, and those who are in our hearts and minds, saints of God. Amen.